Welcome back to Lockfall Labs. Today I'll be showing how to pick a Medeco. This video is a remake of an old video of mine, where the basic idea on how to pick these locks was simply to take out the core, and with the core out, see the angles your pick needed to be to rotate the pins effectively. Here we'll take a more in-depth look at these three different methods to pick Medeco. They'll work for any Medeco, original, biaxial, or M3. Medeco also makes cam format locks, which work a little differently. For now, we'll be ignoring those types. They still lift and rotate, but the internal parts are different than shown here. Now, I just want to point out that each of these three methods are somewhat preference-based, but also some locks may not open easily with one of them. And in those cases, it's best to try another method. So, ideally, you would learn all three methods so that you can pick a wide range of Medeco locks. All right, here we are looking from the front of the lock. Now let's cut away the core. We can see the sidebar at rest in the Bible groove. Note how the sidebar is quite tight against the top of this groove, but there's a little bit of a gap towards the bottom just due to the asymmetrical shape of the sidebar. So these shapes give the effect that is commonly known among pickers. If you pick counterclockwise tension and put that on the core, it will bind up the sidebar first, likely before the pins at the shear line. So the sidebar bears into the pins if you go counterclockwise or to the left. To the right, or clockwise tension on the core, will allow you to pick all the pins to shear line first, ignoring rotation in the sidebar and dealing with those later. Okay, let's go ahead and zoom back out and cut away the side of the lock to see everything that's inside. If you haven't seen my video on Medeco operation, check out the card above. We're going to demonstrate each of the three methods, but not fully pick this lock, as otherwise it would make this video very lengthy. So our first method is going to be picking with clockwise tension, which means our pins will bind first at the shear line. We're going to just set all the pins to shear without going through all the picking motions. I've covered this process in previous videos, and on Medeco it's pretty easy and pretty much the same. In this lock we only have a single mushroom pin for a security top driver, which is typical. Most locks will have 1 to 3 security pins. If you'd like to see more about security pins in depth, check out the card above. After you pick everything to shear, usually you'll drop into a slight false set that has a distinctive feel. This tells you that you're now on the sidebar. Alright, now we can focus on pin rotation. We aren't likely to get an open at this point because the sidebar is our effective locking device, even though the pins are all at the shear line. You can see some of the pins have fallen down as they may or may not be binding against the sidebar. Some have stayed up as they're either dirty or stuck on the sidebar. So the procedure for testing is to crank on some heavy tension. Still clockwise, now brush or pick under each pin looking for a binder. Similar when looking for a binding pin when going to shear, but instead of lifting, I usually do a kind of back and forth motion, what I like to call the clicky method. The pins, if not bound, will make a very distinctive and loud tick, 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 almost like a mechanical watch or a clock. If this sound and feeling is not there, you've likely found a bound pin. Some people do a bounce up and down, and they call that a jiggle test. This works nearly as good, but I tend to prefer the back and forth movement with either a gem type pick or a deep hook. We don't really care much the type of sound that it makes. There are some differences, and either the pin is not yet binding or it's set correctly. But at this point, we're not really concerned about the pin making sound as much as we're concerned about the pin not making sound or moving. You don't need any kind of listening device to hear these sounds, so we'll use them to our advantage. Okay, let's see it in action. Click back and forth, and if we found no sound, we know it's the one to work on. Pin 1 here gives a lot of sound and movement. That means we weren't really bound that much, so move on to check pin 2. Now pin 2 gives us sound and moves easily with tension on, so this is the case of not moving as much because we're in a true gate, but it doesn't really matter. Again, we can move on. Okay, we test pin 3 and we find we get no noise or movement at all. We even have to reach up to get at the pin. So to actually rotate a pin, first we need to let up a lot on tension, but not so much that we drop our driver pins. Then we can just rotate or kind of tilt our pick to one side. in this case to the left, and positioning it just past the pin, we give it a pull. This should easily rotate the pin if you're not stuck too hard in a false gate. Otherwise, you'll have to come up off the tension even more. You could also push from the front, but I find pulling from the rear of the pin to be more controllable. Let's look from the side, and we can see that we get stuck in our false gate. This would likely still give us feedback that we are bound. However, it might not, and we might have to come back to it later. Let's say we have to deal with it now. Let's tilt our pick over to the right, pull this pin back the other way. Now testing it, again, we would get a nice clicky sound and be all good. If this was the last pin, we'd likely be open. You can already see the downside of method 1. It's all in the tension control. If you drop too much to get out of a false gate, you could drop driver pins and have to start over somewhat. You'd basically give up on rotation and then have to go and check all the pins that they're back at shear. So overall, I feel a bit more of skills involved with fine motor control using this method. Even if you let up a lot on tension, you can still get stuck in those false gates. If you remember in my first Medeco video, this is why false gates matter a lot for pick resistance. Basically, the more the better. Okay, let's reset the lock and move on to method number 2. So you can see all the drivers are back down and pin rotations are reset. This time we're going to put counterclockwise tension on the core. And if you remember from the beginning, clockwise we had to set all of our pins to shear first, but counterclockwise, the shape of the sidebar will now make it so that the pin rotation needs to be set first. I like this method a lot because it lets you focus on the hardest part of the lock up front. Another advantage that becomes apparent is that you can completely drop tension to get a pin to really rotate for sure. Also, orientations that are in the middle, not 20 degrees to either side, I think are a little bit easier this way. All right, let's start at pin 1 for this method. Let's do our same clicky test. Check it out. All right, it's bound up, so no sound. So we tilt our pick a little bit to the right and give it a pull. And then we can test again. It's still bound. So let's tilt it a little bit to the left and pull. And here we could let up all the way off of our tension if we needed to. Or we could keep just a little bit so you know when the pin is getting to the right area. But if we're trying to get out of this false gate, we would likely have to let up most of the way on tension. Clicky test again. It has sound, so we're good and we could move on. Let's just skip pin 2 since it doesn't have any false gates and it's set already. We do our clicky test and find out it's fine and move on. So in pin 3, we'll show our third method. The reason for this is that sometimes binding order going clockwise or counterclockwise is not really guaranteed. Or sometimes pins bind up alternating to the sidebar and to shear. Out of 20 or so Medecos that I've picked, this has only happened on a couple locks, but I don't feel it's a large enough sample size to really say for sure how many are like this or need this method. Either way, though it's not often used by me, I'll present it here. So if you do have one of those rare locks, we'll likely use this method. You could also use it because you really need to pick a lock clockwise or counterclockwise, and it doesn't like to bind that way. Let's say clockwise because it's in a padlock body. And in the case that it binds easier counterclockwise, this would be the method. Basically, it's lifting and rotating the pins at the same time. And let's call this method the hybrid method. So if people say they're picking clockwise, they usually mean method 1. Counterclockwise, they're meaning method 2. In this hybrid method, you could tension either direction. So let's tilt our pick to the left and give this pin 3 a lift. And you can see that we're both getting to shear as well as giving a slight rotation of the pin. You can also pulse lifting, so letting the pin back down slightly and then pushing it up again. And this will set rotation a little bit more reliably as you lift. But after you get to shear, you would then do your clicky test to determine if you tilted your pick the right way. We can see that we didn't in this case, so we'll have to reset the pin or possibly the whole lock and pick it to shear again. But this time we'll tilt our pick to the right to now get both to shear as well as rotation set correctly. Also, one minor thing to note with all these methods. As you can see, I usually always position my pick just behind the chisel tip. If you're in front of it, you can still lift, but rotation will be in the opposite direction. I just find that I have more control behind the tip. At face value, this method does look easier. It seems to solve some of the problems of the other methods. But the main reason it's harder to execute is that you have to memorize the order in which you pick, as well as the direction you tilt your pick when lifting. If anything goes wrong, you need to remember that and then vary the side that you tilt next time you're setting it to shear. I suppose as you pick, you could write down on a sheet or chart the orientations, but most people only take notes in safe locks and not common locks like this, or even harder high security locks. Now, this method isn't usually required, but if it is, congratulations, you've purchased yourself a hard to pick Medeco. But overall, it's a great tool to practice and have around just in case, and will pick just about any Medeco. In the end, I don't tend to use it that much as I like counterclockwise. I find it easier for me and it works on a lot of locks. But try all the methods and let me know what you think. So that's about all I know for Medeco picking. There are a few random other minor things, such as pressing the lever at the back of the M3 and all that. But for the most part, they're unique to each type of Medeco, so I won't be getting into them right now. I hope you enjoyed these picking techniques and have fun. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up so I know to make more. Consider subscribing if you want to be notified of future videos like this. Thank you.